as a last 8%er, we take responsibility for our situation and our emotions, which is part of what you're saying. Number two, that we ask not why is this happening to us? Why is this happening for us? Like, what transformation is coming out of this, no matter how difficult it is? And if we see it that way, all of a sudden we get this great learning. And so, a couple other beliefs are just that we see our last 8% as something we want to walk towards, because that's our greatest opportunity to transform. And then finally, we know that it's emotions that get in the way, so we got to build skills to manage our emotions.
Hello, and welcome to today's version of Curated Insights with Seth Dechtman. Our special guest is JP Pawliw-Fry. Welcome to the show, JP.
You say my name so well.
Well, as you know, I was practicing pretty much all day, so I'm glad. I'm glad that I had that 8% moment to be able to execute and deliver when it's most important. Well, so JP, today we're going to have a great conversation about a lot of different things, but it's going to be centered around pressure. But there's so much to say about that. There's pressure in the pandemic. There's pressure in the post-pandemic. There's pressure pre-pandemic. So pressure can be healthy. It can be less healthy. It's something that we live with all the time. Yeah. And I know a lot of your work kind of swivels, or not kind of, really swivels and hinges on how we as humans in our day-to-day life, in our performance, moving towards our goals and what's important to us, how we deal with it. I want to first establish a little bit about the concept of the last 8%. So in a nutshell, could you just share with us what that concept is in your words?
I can, but first I got to say, it's so great to be with you. I love hanging out with you, Seth. I
Thanks.
love the work you do. I really love the work you do and how you really understand a client's needs, and you're really engaged. I love that. Just like you are on the tennis court, which we might talk about today.
I think I have a sneaking suspicion we are going to talk about tennis a little bit today.
Maybe a little bit with Wimbledon and everything else and your tennis game. But here's the thing, last 8%. So it's a curious story. 7 years ago, I'm working with a senior leader and their second in command. And the senior leader, the CEO, was moved up to that position ahead of the second in command. And so, internal succession, but now they're not getting along. So I was working with the whole team. They asked me to coach each of them, to improve the performance of that senior team. Fortune 100 company, big company. So, coaching them, they have a conversation. I coached them to have a conversation. They came back to individual coaching sessions. How'd it go? Horrible. The only thing they could agree on is that they wanted me to coach them. Not that I'm a great coach. I'm not saying that for that reason. So listen, not coach them, but mediate. So the three of us spend 2.5 hours and mediating a conversation. And it finishes. We go back to individual coaching sessions a few days later. And I asked each of them individually, how'd it go? They both said, oh my gosh, so much better. I said, great. I said, did you say everything you wanted to say? They said, yeah. I'm like, really? I'm coaching them, right? I know they're not saying everything they want to say. They're leaving something, on the table. And I said, really? And I pushed them, and both of them agreed, okay, maybe not. Then I pushed them again. What's the percentage? Because I'm a bit of a geek, right? We survey over 40,000 people a month. So I like data. Right. And they both agreed around between 5 and 10% they were leaving out. They didn't actually speak their truth. And to me, this was the story that started it all. We did a study of 34,000 people, and we tried to understand, what is it? How do we do when it comes to these more difficult parts of a conversation? And we find this. We get to 85, 90, 92% on average of what we want to say. But when we get to that last 8%, that more difficult part of the conversation, a really interesting phenomenon takes place. Let's say you and I are having it. I get to 92. I'm starting to push past 92. You start to get triggered because you're no dummy. You see where this conversation is going. You know that there's consequences attached for you and your career and your ability to provide and all those things. You start to get triggered and emotional. I get infected by your emotion because emotions are infectious.
Right.
And in that moment, as opposed to facing it, having the conversation, I back off, I avoid it. Now, here's the problem. You're a pretty smart guy, Seth, but you can't read my mind. Our people can't read our minds.
No.
So they leave that conversation thinking we had the whole conversation. In fact, I leave thinking I had the whole conversation because, I checked off most of the boxes of what I wanted to talk about, conveniently leaving out that more difficult last 8% part. A month later, I'm looking at you, Seth, and I'm going, what's going on, Seth? Why are you still doing what we talked about? You're looking at me. Again, this is all in our thoughts in our head. You're looking at me going, JP, why are you being so passive aggressive? I thought we're on track. The problem is we never had the last 8% conversation. George Bernard Shaw has this great quote. He said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. It never took place.
Right.
And the last 8% started with conversations, how some individuals, some leaders, some organizations are better at having these last 8%. And the consequences for having them are immense. We get much better results. As a leader, our reputation goes up. It doesn't go down. You know this. You're a basketball guy, right? One of the great coaches, you know this, I coach coaches. And one of the coaches that I've worked with is Doc Rivers. And Doc Rivers said to me once, JP, if you don't deal with the underperformers in the room, you'll lose the room. And for anyone who's not a basketball fan, you know, the dressing room is what he's talking about. People will see you, other players will see you not dealing with an underperformer, not having that last 8%, and you'll lose the respect of all of them. And then when you want to coach and exert influence, they're having nothing of it. And so these moments matter for us as leaders and how we're perceived. And by the way, there's someone else watching. We're watching. You know this as a tennis player. When you see yourself kind of not pushed past into the last 8%, you start to feel a certain shame and embarrassment, and your confidence goes down, affecting the next point you play. And in business, affecting the next decision you make. So there's a lot hinging on how well do we do in these last 8% moments.
Wow. There's a lot to talk about there. The phrase is a lot to unpack. You specifically use the word conversation. Is that on purpose, the last 8% of the conversation, because we want action? We want to do something. You know, they talk about bias for action. People want to be moving in the right direction or facing the issues head on, but you keep saying the word conversation. Is that on purpose?
Well, what's interesting, Seth, and again, I'm shouting you out to your clients a little bit here, but the fact that you know this content as you do means that you can ask a question, which I actually forgot to mention, which is this. And I don't know if it was intentional on your part, but
no, honestly, it wasn't, because where my mind is going is, especially with the CEOs that you were mediating, I mean, these are powerful dudes. They know they left something on the table or something unsaid. They kind of, we all do it, conned ourselves and walked away, said, God, we got to 92. Come on, 92. That'll get me into any school in the country almost. But I understand you're pointing to that last 8% is really where the transformation, where the gold is. And it's a conversation. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. So here's what I kind of left out, which is this. That's where it started. So 8 years ago, that's where it started with these leaders and the study. But we continued with the study because as we introduced this to clients, they're like, you know, it's not just conversations we're avoiding, it's decisions. So we did some work on that. And we found that when we get to these, and it was a little less than 8%, more like 7%, 7.5%, whatever. But when we hit those more difficult decisions, that's when we start to put them off and we're afraid to take action on them. But then it wasn't just decisions, it wasn't just conversations, it's also tasks, right? A good one is like, we all want to be healthy, right? So we want to eat well and exercise. Those are last 8% moments. Do we actually follow through and exercise or eat according to our plan, whatever that might be? All of those moments, what's characteristic is that there's some emotion gets in our way that stops us from having the conversation because of how we might be perceived by others, making the decision because we don't want to upset people, right? And I'll tell you about 2 people decisions that we really mess up on, or those tasks. So it's actually more than conversations, but that's where it started.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. And I could see the emotional tie-in there. And, you know, I as you were just sharing this last piece, we've heard this play not to lose versus play to win.
Right.
And the last 8%, it's like, what happens emotionally where we have the courage to get to that 92%? We have the last 8%. And then something happens, the pressure comes in, or all the work that we've done to create that moment that the result could hinge on, or the transformation could expand from. We kind of leave it there to percolate and to fate's chance rather than being the cause in the matter. Is that what you found?
Yeah. So again, honestly, I think you and I could probably talk for hours on this because I love where you're going. So here's what I would say, Seth. There's a couple of important parts here. One is it's almost table stakes, the 92%, right? If you're going to be in a decent organization, in an organization, you want to be a decent performer. Like if you think of a normal distribution of a population, on the ends, the top 10%, the bottom 10%, but in the middle, if you just want to kind of be in the middle, you know, you got to be pretty competent at 92%. But really, when you want to be that high performer, it's because you can do things that everyone else won't do, right? You can do other things in that last 8% that other people get stopped at because of emotions, as you were talking about. There's an irony in all of this. Oh, it's like sweet irony. And again, you know this from being an athlete. While it's more scary to be in that last 8%, while our careers, our organizations are differentiated by how we do in these last 8%, the irony is that we need that last 8% to transform ourselves, right? Like in a sense, in the work we do, and we've got this whole thing called the Last 8% Project. And the idea is that we want to give people insights and tools so they can step into these last 8%. And the reason you want to step in is because that will become, if you have the skills, it will become a transformational experience. I'll give you an example. I've been to 6 Olympic Games. You fly back from an Olympics, and there's a couple of things going on. Number one, the worst thing you can do is fly back thinking, we didn't take our shots. Like the game came and went, it was over. We trained so hard and we got tentative. That's the worst. It happened to me once on a team. It was the worst. It was like, oh my gosh, can we go back? So number one, and I think our life is like that because you want to come to the end of your life and think, I didn't take my shots. So that's one learning. But the other learning is, I've worked with athletes for many years now. When you talk to athletes and they look back at their careers, all of them will say their greatest learning, their greatest transformation was in those last 8% moments. And by the way, we know that from our data in organizations. And so here's the point. The irony is that it scares us the most, differentiates us, and it's also where our greatest opportunity for transformation lies. Because what happens is that if we don't back off, if we move into it, we learn so much about ourselves and we realize the sky didn't fall, we weren't fired, and all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh. And we grow in a little bit of confidence and we get this upward spiral now. And now we go on and we take other things and we grow our capability, organization's capability. And it's so exciting to see. There's almost nothing. And Seth, honestly, you had a really tough time, and maybe watchers will know this, maybe they won't, but you had a tough time getting to that final and not playing the game you wanted to play. And yet you were able at one point, and I should let you tell the story, but you were able to get over that. And, you kind of conquered that fear. You got over that hump. And then all of a sudden, you're a different person. You've got a different understanding, different insight. That's what's possible. That's what's possible for all of us, no matter what our last 8% situation is. And to me, I find that so exciting.
Yeah, it is. You have to live it. And it took me literally 10 years of being on the other side of that transformation. Now, I have to tell you, JP, I accomplished the goal. I won the final. It was extraordinary. It was exhilarating. It was a relief. So many emotions. But that 8% is still there. It's not like it's one and done. And, it's something that I still have the muscle to develop around that 8% because I notice now I'm in situations similar and sometimes I'm able to execute and sometimes I'm not. And it really is that emotion or that mindset.
Yeah.
And although talking with you in the concept and intellectually about these ideas, and I can really see for myself, and I think everybody else can see on the other side of this 8% is where that transformation, where there's a new way of being to really come forth. But what that barrier, that obstacle, the fear, the lack of courage, the not wanting to risk, that's where I find for me, the work had to be done. And even though I know, just be more courageous, knowing it didn't make a difference for me, or this is the moment, the actual moment in that activity or that business moment where you have to be braver. Okay. I understand. What do I do?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this, Seth. There's a couple of things. One is that you won that big contest, so to speak, and that big barrier. Yeah. And in a sense, your life didn't change that much afterwards, like the actual material life that you lead. And that's actually a big insight because for many people, they think, especially, pro sports or in organizations where most of my work is, they think, if I can just get there, then everything will be glorious. No, that's not the way the world works. It's actually interesting. Once you had some success, then one of the big insights is when you go into your next big performance, there's a little less on the line because you're like, well, I win, I lose. My life doesn't change that much. And then you have less tightness about, I've got to win. And so let's say this. Let's go back, though, to a really important question, because I think for people who are listening and watching, the question is, okay, what do we do? Right? Like, great, last 8% matters. What do we do? Well, this is an internal game. You need to understand yourself. You need to understand what's your predictable default behavior. So all of us, and we've done some pretty good research on this, when we face the last 8%, we do one of two things. When we struggle with it, we do one of two things.
Okay.
We either avoid, which we've talked about, or we try, but we get so emotional or we get so frustrated that we make a mess and we impact the person in a way we don't intend. We've all done it. I've done it. You've done it. We've all done it.
Right. So it's avoid.
Yeah, avoid.
Or make a mess.
Or make a mess.
Okay.
So it's important for everyone watching, and by the way, we have, and we'll put this in the notes, but we have an assessment you can do. It's free online to understand
we'll definitely put that in the notes for sure.
Yeah. So the thing is that you need to have a level of self-awareness to know, what am I? Because if you don't know that, you're going to use the wrong strategy. Okay. Now self-awareness, now you need emotional management skills. What are the exact tools and insights that I need so that I can calm this emotional part of our brain, which is really what's going on, and keep moving forward into the pressure, into the last 8%. What's interesting, Seth, is that what we found is that both for athletes, but really, again, for leaders, as they move into those scary areas, it's their thinking about it that freaks them out more than the actual event. And if you know that and you have some strategies, so one of the emotional, management strategies is actually not emotion at all. It's a cognitive strategy to understand your thinking, that voice in our head. And again, there are tools that you can learn. And mindfulness, by the way, is a really important part of this. So you can sit there, and this is going to sound maybe a little out there for some, but you can sit there after learning these insights to know that there's you and then there's your thoughts. And there's a space between you and your thoughts. We don't have to believe everything we think.
Right.
And
our listeners are aware of that.
Yeah. Well, great. Because sometimes that's like people are like, I don't get it. But here's the thing. If you really understand that experientially, not just like cognitively, but if you understand that, all of a sudden you're walking into whatever and you see that thought and you're like, great. Don't push it away. I had an NBA coach once who I was working with. He would get physically sick before every game in the season. And you know how many games there are preseason, regular, and they went to the postseason. I think they had almost 100 games that year. He was physically sick. When I started working with him, he's like, JP, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to coach anymore because I don't want to feel this. So what we did, and so this is a great insight for people. When you feel that, welcome it. Welcome it. Don't push it away. Don't try and not feel it. Just welcome it and see what happens to it. And you'll see that it just is a sine wave. It comes and then it goes away all by itself. It's our reaction to it. It's our pushing it away and we're getting hooked by it that causes us all the problems. For the athletes who I work with, I don't know why we're talking so much about athletes, maybe because you're tennis.
But it's very applicable. I mean, it's no accident that so many great business people were former athletes or that athletes are drawn to business. It's very applicable.
It is. And I guess the only thing I want to make sure is that for people who aren't athletes, just know that the work that we do isn't just for people who understand athletics. But I'll just say this. When you have that thought, you sit there and you welcome it. You go, you're back. And there's different frames, but one is, this is my body getting ready to perform. And by the way, if you've got a bit of maturity, it's like, this means a moment's coming that I'm really going to be living. Because again, when you follow leaders when they're much older, when you follow athletes when they're much older, they look back, they're like, those were those moments that I learned it and I grew, but I was really alive. And so now you're like, oh my gosh, I want to look for those situations like last 8%.
So hold on a minute. If a person, myself, yourself, is in touch enough with the voice in your head or the emotions or that inner dialogue that's not necessarily helping, that's really great. So that's like a signal to say, hey, this is an 8% moment that's coming. That's really great. That's really rich.
It is. And it's, by the way, this is where life is really, I want to say,
lived.
We want to be in every moment. We do. Like, that's kind of the goal really in life, in my opinion. But this is that signal. I like the way you just described that. It's a signal that says, hey, this is a moment where we are truly living. And again, having now, like when I think of the first Olympics that I went to and the first work I did with athletes, I just think, gosh, I don't think I did very well, honestly, because I'm like, there's so much wisdom I did. Not that I have great wisdom now, but I just know I have a little bit more than I did then. But this is a big one, right? Because if you can go in and you're like, hey, this is a moment to really live in, to live with joy, to be joyful, Think about a leader who
Right.
shows up with a real pressure moment. And okay, maybe they're not singing and juggling things, but they walk in with a joy. It affects everyone else in the room because we know emotions are infectious. This is
Right.
how we get to that higher level of potential because everyone goes, oh, okay, my life's not on the line. Because
Right.
that's what it is. Seth, you know this. We spend so much of our time, a lot of our bandwidth taken up by impression management. How are we coming across to others? Are we respected? Are we loved?
Yeah.
It just gets in the way. And so
Yeah.
we need tools to manage that. And when we do, all of a sudden, we can do anything. We're like, let's go. Like right now on this call, if we can just be our free selves. And I feel like we have, like, you got some great questions. And I'm like, oh, wow, interesting. Like, I didn't think of it that way. Signal,
Right.
great. Like, stuff like that, right? It's so exciting.
I can see, I'm imagining what you're sharing. Forget sports for a minute. You have an important business meeting, and before you walk into the room, people are waiting, whether you're the protagonist of it or not.
Right.
There are things that need to be said that don't know exactly how to perfectly be said, or communications that, given past history, are going to be received unfavorably or with even some challenges or whatnot.
Yep.
And if I'm that person and I'm walking into the room and I have my hand on the knob and I turn and my mindset is, okay, here we go, I kind of know what's going to happen.
Yep.
That's an avoiding and recipe for a mess. As opposed to, I have my hand on the door and I could say, okay, I'm sensing based on past that this is something that might look unfavorable and might be challenged and is going to be somewhat difficult. But that's the signal right there. Let's turn this thing. Let's transform it. And it's easier said than done, JP.
Oh, it is. And so let me give another hack, like an insight that can be really helpful. When anyone who's watching this is walking into the room that Seth is talking about, a negotiation, a presentation, an important meeting, whatever it is, as you walk in, first of all, know this, especially when there's that protagonist, antagonist. Let's really keep it to that because I want to stick to something you said. So it's a meeting, let's say. If you open that meeting in the following way, I will guarantee you, and I mean this, if it's done genuinely, I will guarantee you it will change the mood of the room. It will create a much more effective meeting, literally. Okay, here's what it is. So Seth, you and I, we're negotiating something, okay? So I'm going to role play it almost so people can really see it. So you and I are negotiating, or we're going into, business and whatever it is, right? There's a contentious point. And I walk in and there's, your lawyers and my lawyers, whatever. There's 10 people in the room. And I walk in and I'm kind of gracious and genuine and just whoever I am. And I don't start by saying, blah, blah, blah. I start by saying, Seth, I'm a little anxious right now. I'm anxious because I care about our relationship. It's got to be genuine, of course, but I'm anxious because I care about our relationship and I'm feeling this rock and hard place. I feel like, I have a point of view, but I know you're not too keen about that. That's the rock. The hard place is I feel, a responsibility to my organization, to my family, whatever it is. And so I'm struggling right now. I just want to share that before we start. Now, this isn't a tool to manipulate. It's for you to understand my intention. If you can understand my intention, and it's got to be genuine, you can't fake this, but if you can understand my intention, all of a sudden, all that pressure dissipates. And it's great if you join me and say the same thing, and we have this different conversation.
Right.
We're having the right conversation. And by the way, if that's the case, and you know this as well, when we're often in a negotiation, so much of it, unfortunately, is I got to prove impression management. I got to prove that I won.
Right.
Like that is the word, because then it's so hard to back down. Whereas if I come in and say, hey, I'm anxious right now, and here's how I'm feeling, and I'm feeling a rock and a hard place. I mean, this is literally what we teach in our Last 8% Academies. How do you walk in to a last 8% moment, manage yourself, manage the environment so you can get to a great outcome for everyone? And it's not, not just negotiation, but that might even surprise people because people think you got to come in, you got to be strong and powerful, and I want this, and no, right?
Now, it's fascinating because as I'm listening to you again, what I was thinking is that, okay, the ones that avoid or make the mess, it's that classic self-sabotage. And then you walk away and you go, you see, it happened again.
Yeah.
And then you get to be right about it. You get to be right and a little bit of a victim to the circumstance rather than being at the cause of it all.
Seth, once we turn this off, let's just keep talking, because again, I love where you're going. So at the last 8% project, we have this belief, right? We have a bunch of beliefs. Number one, as a last 8%er, we take responsibility for our situation and our emotions, which is part of what you're saying. Number two, that we ask not why is this happening to us? Why is this happening for us? Like, what transformation is coming out of this, no matter how difficult it is? And if we see it that way, all of a sudden we get this great learning. And so, a couple other beliefs are just that we see our last 8% as something we want to walk towards, because that's our greatest opportunity to transform. And then finally, we know that it's emotions that get in the way. So we got to build skills to manage our emotions. Those are the beliefs. And we are creating a whole movement around this.
Yeah, I love it.
Last 8%, because we think there's 85% of people, Seth, 85% of people die with a significant regret in their life. Kind of not on my watch. Not that I'm so full of myself, but I'm going to do everything I can to decrease that number.
Right. Well, with the lives you touch, it's very powerful. I don't know if I heard it on social media in your feed or somewhere, but it's like you're either heading towards your goal, which you can consider a win. In one case, it could be a tennis match, or a business adventure. Or if you don't achieve it, or in simple terms, you lose, there's either winning or learning.
Yes.
And from the paradigm that you're talking about with those rules, that's the learning, that's the being responsible. It's hard. It's hard. Because the world is pulling you into excuse, justify, being dominated, avoid being dominated, explaining it away, describing it away. It's hard, man. It's hard.
Yeah. Listen, this is not an easy path, no question. It is hard. Even more reason why we want to build these insights and skills and tools, for sure. I'll say this. There was a guy named Steven who you might have heard of, but he 5 times, once a year, he applied to USC film school. Didn't get in, didn't get in. And he sat there in that moment and he felt like, oh my gosh, life sucks. He's depressed, but he just kept trying and kept trying. And of course, on the 6th time, he finally got in. And Steve is now Steven Spielberg. Maybe you know the story. But what's
I've heard of him.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you've heard of this guy. But the thing is that Steven Spielberg would say that those moments of not getting in were, again, those last 8% moments, and they weren't success, but they were learning.
Right.
They were learning, and he almost needed that to go and spend 10,000 hours in front of the TV watching films, watching how people do it, getting an education, still a huge education, so that when he got out, he had this wisdom about his craft that he might not otherwise have had. So I want everyone to just listen to what Seth said, right? We have this moment. No matter what happens, it either moves things forward or you learn a lot, which will move things forward. But if we take a long enough view, that's the key. Like and here's what I want to say. In the middle of success, it can feel like failure. In the middle of success, it can feel like failure. But if your view is long enough and you're like, okay, it feels like failure, don't believe that thought in your head. This is just learning. Kind of your point. So
that's really rich. And even, completely call it honest, vulnerable, authentic, even as I'm saying what I said, and then I finish it off with, it's really hard. It's almost like a baked in justification, like I'm dramatizing it and I'm still bringing that emotion, like it's so hard. Like there's still that infinitesimal little residue of like the back door to not be responsible. Does that communicate?
Oh, no, absolutely. And so again, what I love about that is you're sitting there going, even in my response, like it is hard. I want to absolutely norm that. It is hard. And can we see it slightly different? Which is your point, right? That signal, hey, I'm really living, or hey, I'm really learning. Or to the degree that I spend some of my bandwidth focused on, oh, it's so hard, not that you're doing this, but we become that victim. Is that
right?
So again, that's the learning. We said earlier, it's not easy. It's an internal path, but oh my goodness, this investment in ourselves. Here, I'll say this, this, Seth. I've got 3 kids and I'm motivated by a lot of things, but my kids, they're a big one. When I think about all the work that we're doing, and I think that, as I say to parents, don't worry that your child doesn't always listen to you. Worry that they're constantly watching you. And for me, I wish I would have trusted that when my kids were younger, because they're all 24, 22, and 18 now. But for everyone watching, trust that they're just watching your model. Don't worry they don't always listen to you. You'll get into fights you don't need to get into. Just know that they're watching. 20 years from today, when they face their COVID, their whatever, They will model your behavior. And for me, that's almost why I'm so committed to doing this work, because I want to keep, I'm imperfect, but I want to keep showing up a little bit better, a little bit better. So my 18-year-old can see me taking risks, falling flat on my face, keep going.
Yeah.
Because, and it's a hard path, but oh my gosh, the fruit, the consequences, not just for work and for performance, but for young people we're influencing. Oh my goodness.
No, that's really great. And what did you say? You said this might not look or feel what success looks like.
No, what I said is in the middle of success, it can feel like failure.
In the middle of success, it can feel like failure. That's really beautiful. We're running out of time, and I just want to be responsible it's not a huge pivot, but I wanted to ask a few other questions.
Please. Sure.
So, we have had a very prolonged period of 8%. People imagine that pre-pandemic, we're having so much momentum in business and life and relationships in any realm of where they're operating. And then the pandemic comes where there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of opportunities to create mess. There's a lot of things to avoid because, hey, it's a pandemic, right? What could you share with us have been some of your biggest learnings during the pandemic?
It's literally the same thing that you find in a big contest at sport. Pressure doesn't make us better. We know categorically that people perform worse under pressure, not better. We all think some people perform better under pressure. It's a complete and utter lie when you look at the data. Michael Jordan shot worse on the free throw line under pressure situations than otherwise, consistent with every other NBA player in the history of the game. And I could give you a whole bunch of examples from work, teams under pressure, people making decisions. I won't, but just trust me, the data's there.
Sure.
But people don't do better.
The data's there.
Yeah, but people don't do better under pressure. They get negatively affected. But what they do is that they fall to their level of training. They fall to their level of preparation. Pressure reveals. We don't get better under pressure. Pressure reveals us. And so what this pandemic for me was it showed me, with all the leaders we work with in organizations around the world, and not in a judgmental way do I say this, more as an observer, those leaders who were kind of swimming naked. They said, I care about my people. But you know what? Push comes to shove. I wasn't that impressed. So I think what the pandemic revealed for me is those leaders who truly were kind of walking their talk, who were truly showing up, who were being vulnerable at times, saying, hey, folks, I'm not sure what's happening. We're going to do our best, versus those who went in with bravado. I know what's going on. And of course, they didn't.
Right.
And so to me, that's part of what it revealed. Number two, right now, there's our data's picking up a couple of interesting trends. And you might see this, but we have people in organizations who have been working from home, and they kind of like, hey, it's not so bad. I don't have to commute. I don't have to deal with Gary by their pressure.
People are saying that.
That's right. So they're like, I kind of like this. I like to see people still, but I kind of like this. Number two, they got a little bit more money in their pocket because they weren't traveling. They weren't spending it.
Right.
And number three, they're sitting there going, do I want to go back to the way it was? And so there's a moment right now where people are starting to think, what do I want? And to me, this is, again, it reveals those organizations and really those managers and leaders who have the skills to engage their people. Because those who have engaged their people, they're having the conversation as opposed to avoiding the conversation, the last 8%, right? They're making decisions, thinking about how can we keep people engaged? Like what can we do? I have some organizations who I work with who are like, no, we're going back to 5 days a week. That's just the way it is. 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever it is. That's just what we're doing. And I'm like, okay, great, but you're going to get the consequence of that because now people realize I don't really have to do this anymore. And so it's revealing like those folks who are like, okay, no, let's have a conversation. And hey, maybe we'll go to 2 and 3 days on and off or whatever it is. Let's think about how can we create. It's like they trust their people and they trust the conversation, even though they let go of control a bit and they come up with better solutions.
Right.
That's
that in itself, that reevaluation, I'm sorry I cut you off, but that reevaluation is an 8% conversation in itself.
It is. It totally is. And I got to tell you, like, Seth, you're an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. I run my business. You run your business. And at times, part of the reason we do that is that we want to have control. I do to a certain degree for sure. But there are times that I've learned from my senior team to kind of let go and just trust in that the conversation will lead to where it needs to lead to. And that has been so valuable for me, right?
Right.
And so I think for all the leaders who are watching, you got to trust, right? You got to trust your team. You got to trust yourself that you can deal with whatever the decision is. Because at the end of the day, here's what we know. The organizations who can truly keep good people, really engage them, get that discretionary effort from them because they feel part of something, they feel included, they are the ones who are going to win. Because the world is changing so fast, nobody knows the right answers. And there's a great Japanese proverb that says, all of us are smarter than any one of us. And if that's true, and it is, then we just need to be in these last 8% conversations so we can use all of us to get to that place. And that's, by the way, that's when it's really exciting. That's when we feel more connected. And that's when we have more joy. Joy comes from our personal relationships more than anything else. So there's so many layers here.
Yeah, no, it's very rich. And I just love when something is distinguished in language, like the final 8% or the 8%, where it just captures something that somebody who's not dealing with the data and isn't doing the level of research and crunching the numbers, which is what you do. But when it lands over here for me, I can identify it with it, and it captures a concept that provides access to breakthroughs, provides access to new ways of being, provides access for new results. And it's really, really cool. If you'd like to learn more about this speaker, visit our website at 𝘗𝘦𝘳𝘮𝘪𝑗𝑡𝑠.com. There you'll find dozens of videos of speakers that are a perfect fit for your event. If you'd like to reach out directly, please click on the link below in the description. My name is Seth Dechtman, and you've been watching Curated Insights.